I thank you very much for coming and engaging in this conversation about Gen Ed outcomes, and where we might be able to go with Gen Ed from some of the work that they've done. So I'll immediately turn it over to our panelists for today, and thank you again for being here.
So thank you for coming. My name is Deb Allen. I am the Assistant Provost in the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment. So I'll let the rest of the team introduce themselves.
Oh, hi, my name is I'm Dee Nichols. I am a faculty member in the College of Education and Human Development within the Literacy Program, and serving right now as Vice President of Faculty Senate and Chair of Academic Affairs.
I'm Mandy Barrington, Assessment Coordinator in the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment.
I'm Sam Haynes. I'm at Anthropology, and I'm Chair of the General Education Subcommittee on faculty.
Thane Freeman, and I'm Chair of Psychology.
So our team was put together last spring and summer. We attended the AAC&U Institute on General Education and Assessment last summer. We worked together to develop an action plan thinking about reforming gen education, and we attended a lot of sessions, and it was a great conference. And Dee is going to talk a little bit more later about the action plan that we put together. So just to give you a sense of what today's forum is, it's multiple components. It's about 5 different components. So we're going to start by having you, Dee's going to have you reflect on a few questions pertaining to general education. And then we're going to move in to talk about Gen Ed at UMaine, our structure, as well as some assessments that we've done to date. And Mandy and Dee will talk about those. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the future. So we're going to look at the strategic vision and values framework. And we're also going to talk about some national trends in Gen Ed, and Thane's going to talk about some innovative models for Gen Ed and also Gen Ed branding at other institutions. And then Sam's going to talk about the work that the Gen Ed subcommittee is doing for this fall as well as the spring. And we're going to conclude with a discussion session. So we have a series of discussion questions, and we brought cards and pencils for you to write some thoughts and feedback. And we'll collect that, but we're also hoping to have an open discussion as well during that time. And the last question is, we're seeking feedback from you on how you feel we could best engage the community in a discussion of Gen Ed and potential Gen Ed reform as we move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Dee.
So, what we're going to do is engage in a instructional strategy called anticipation reaction guides, and we're going to take 4 different statements, and your task is to either agree or disagree with that statement. So statement number 1, you can just either jot it down if you want to, if you have something to write, or just hold it in your head. Statement number 1 is the University of Maine has a well-designed and stewarded general education plan. If you agree with that statement, jot down an A, disagree a D. 2, the University of Maine follows a recognized model for general education. A if you agree, D if you disagree. Statement number 3, general education plays a significant role in preparing University of Maine graduates for life in the 21st century. And the final statement, I'd like you to ponder, is the University of Maine has a way of monitoring general education. You got those in your mind? You know which ones what you believe? So now just reach out to the people around you, 2, 3, 4, and reach consensus. Do you all agree with that statement, or do you disagree with that statement?
So I'm not happy with the general education requirements.
So in our College of Education and Human Development, this is a common practice. This, again, the strategy is anticipation reaction guide. The instructional design we're using is think, pair, share model. So you took some time and thought about your statements, whether you agreed or disagreed. You partnered up, paired up to discuss it. Now we'd like to come back to the whole group and just kind of hear from some of the groups what your overall feelings are with the statement, being conscious of the time. So statement number 1, the University of Maine has a well-designed and stewarded general education plan. Is there a group that would like to take that one on? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take a stab.
Sure.
I feel like how do you define, you know, I'm trying to read. Like, how would you define that, like, that actually prepares them? So that's what we were kind of talking about. And I think the thing, you know, we've seen some courses, I think, that are going towards that direction, but the availability of them are really not there. But more, we thought that these conversations are more taking place in some of the individual first-year seminars of colleges and departments, and those aren't recognized at Gen Eds. So that was kind of the crux of our conversations on that particular 3.
So the consensus of your group was you agreed or disagreed?
I would say more leaning towards disagree.
More leaning towards disagreed.
Question 3.
Did anybody feel strongly one way or another about that statement and would like to add to that conversation?
I apologize. I jumped to 3. I'm sick today, so I was responding to number 3, not number 1. I apologize.
Okay, that makes sense. Oh.
But we
okay,
can,
well,
I apologize.
That's okay. 3 is a good one. So let's look at 3. But it is related. And so in that case, they disagreed with that statement.
Oh, we agreed.
But they agreed with that statement. So talk to me. Why did you agree?
Because I believe that general education plays a significant role in preparing. We have a broad base of requirements, and I see the international perspectives and diversity perspective serving one need, and I see the population and environment serving another, and the science serving another. And I think it does prepare our graduates for life in the 21st century.
All right. I see a couple other hands real quick. Yes, sir.
I'll offer the optimistic take that I offered to my group, but also an initial pessimistic optimistic take. The optimistic take is that the options are so vast and the pathways are so nearly infinite that, yeah, for many students, general education can play a very significant role in preparing them for life in the 21st century. They have lots of different courses they can take. They can be worthwhile. That's great, but there's certainly no guarantee in that vast system that a student will really find something to prepare them for life in a positive way. My optimistic take is I think it probably prepares students pretty well to go up against bureaucracy and difficult computer interfaces and things like that. They do that as part of their general education experience, so maybe that's good.
Yes, sir. Take one more, and then we'll continue on. We're going to keep coming back to these throughout the rest of the session. So, yes.
Yeah, I agree with the first responder that it does help prepare students. One of the things it does is it opens up a topic of conversation with the advisor about what sort of things do you like to do, and what's you could do you like to dance, do you like to paint, do you like to do science. And you can actually have a much deeper advising kind of a session with a student if you use the Gen Ed as a sort of an entry point to sort of those human experience things.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, we will come back to these statements. And hopefully at the end of the session, we'll have some better consensus as a group as to how we are on each one of these statements. So this is really looking at what is it? What should we aspire to? What should general education, what should it do? What is the purpose of a general education? What should it help our students do at UMaine? Some of the things that we've looked at and within our research as we've explored this is we hope that by the time they complete their general education that they're creative, that they're problem solvers, they're engaged, they're innovative, they're critical thinkers, they're versatile, they're able to navigate through a very difficult network. So this is kind of our goal. I looked at this a little bit at what in general, if I just went out and Googled what's the purpose of general education, which I did, it just says it's courses typically designed to teach diverse skills so that every person should master in order to lead a productive life, to become a knowledgeable citizen, to communicate ideas, to become a useful member of society, regardless of whatever course or field of study that they end up taking. So it just provides this broad perspective. We went, as part of our task over this as we continue to work together. We've been exploring other universities' models for general education. And this is what the University of Idaho had to say about their general education. It is broad-based, it is interdisciplinary, multi-year, it's vertically integrated, liberal arts educational experience. The outcomes are aligned with their 5 learning outcomes, and they seek to address the question of what is it that entails a 21st century educated person who meets the meets the needs of an employer, a democratic society, and the challenging of our rapidly changing, diverse world. And if you go to the University of Idaho and you come on, click on this link, maybe.
You have to slide it onto this.
Never mind. What do I need to do?
Move it over.
Come help me, please. On my computer, I just clicked it. So it takes you right to their general education webpage. A really nice, inviting picture where everything is laid out and you're able to explore what it means to get this general education at the University of Idaho. Don't go too far away, okay? We looked at University of Vermont, general education program reflects the faculty's aspirations for the University of Vermont students. General education's foundation is transformative educational experiences. Prepare students to become accountable leaders, bring their work dedication global community, grasp complexity, effective problem solvers, communication skills, ethical conduct. And then we go to University of Maine. And ours says the university's goals is to ensure that all of its graduates, regardless of academic majors they pursued, are broadly educated persons who can appreciate the achievements of civilization. Follow our link. Can you do that real quick?
Oops.
So when we get there, it's going to take us to our catalog. It actually takes us to student records, then links us to the catalog. It's and we have to scroll through here to find the general education, which really, again, is right there. Click on that very first one if you can. Is it too hard to do? And it downloads into a spreadsheet of all our thousands, hundreds of gen ed courses. It's not quite the same as what we see when we look at some of the other universities, our peers, in trying to explain what general education is. It's not quite the attractive list that we're hoping for. Let me go back to this. Thank you. Keep talking. So, we're navigating through. All right, here we are, University of Maine. Oh, there's our, how do we get rid of that screen here? Let's click, maybe we click PowerPoint. Okay.
So sorry.
That's okay. Let's see what happens when we do this. Well, we're working on our screen here. But so when we go in and we look at general education here at the University of Maine, we are looking at these sort of our major categories here: human values, social context, ethics, quantitative literacy, science, writing competency, and thank you, Mandy, so much. And then taking our capstone experience. If we look at our breakdown of what it would look like of the gen ed experience here at the University of Maine, we've laid it out into a table, so you can see that we spend quite a bit in human values and social context. I believe there's 6 courses, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, that are geared towards that. We have 2 that are dedicated towards quantitative literacy, 2 towards writing, 1 toward ethics, their capstone experience, and 2 science. And we believe that taking those courses will help our students reach that attainment and goal of a general education that will make them productive citizens in a democratic society. This summer, while we were at the Institute, and we were with different groups from all across the country, and we were exploring what is general education, and we were learning from each other. we were pretty jazzed. We learned a lot at that particular institute. And we began to even understand our own program a little bit better. We had gathered 2 years of assessment data over our general education. We've been working on this for several years, but we've got 2 years worth of data. And as we started going through the data and analyzing it, it just left us with lots of questions. It's, are our assessments that are lined up to show that our students are meeting the goals of the learning outcomes for their general education? Is it really doing what it's supposed to be doing? Are they aligned? We had all these questions. We went in and we met with other universities who were having the same questions and looking at different models of what it could be. Do you know what we would call our model here at the University of Maine as far as like a model for general education? Does anybody have any idea? What did I hear? Hodgepodge? A hodgepodge model. Possibly. That's a different word for distribution model. And as somebody said earlier, we do have a wide range of courses that are available. I think it's 900 and some, and we'll get to that slide in a little bit, of courses our students can take to meet their general education requirements, and that is called a distribution model. And other universities have that. We're not the only university in this country that utilizes a distribution model. So while we were there, we had a task that we had to go in and try to begin to think about what might work for the University of Maine, and what might how would we facilitate such an endeavor to take on general education and to make some decision, should we begin to think about reforming our general education? And if so, what would that look like? And how do we get there? So that's really the impetus of why we're here today, is to try to share some of those thoughts and ideas. Is it you? Yay. All right. So in our IGEA action plan, is this you two or is this me? No, you go for it. You ready? No. Okay, so we started going in and looking at some of the background, the research in the area. We began looking at different universities. We began looking at what some of the research was saying about what are possibilities for general education and effective models. We looked at thinking about how could we improve our current structure. And then for really the biggest one that we're still trying, and this is part of what this is for, is to help us decide what's the best pathway for us to move forward with campus engagement and possible change. As Sam's going to talk about in a little bit later, this work is being led by the Faculty Senate, both Academic Affairs and General Education Committee combined. Now, please.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
So in preparation for the Institute, we wanted to understand where the journey UMaine has been on with general education over the last 20 years. So 1999 was the first NECHI directive that we needed to assess our gen ed curriculum, and this was also the point at which the students graduated. They were the first cohort to graduate that experienced the same gen ed system that we have today. And then in 2003, and I think in 2004 as well, there were Faculty Senate motions to adopt the gen ed learning outcomes. And then in 2009, NECHI had a second directive to us, this one more broad, about needing to be more engaged in outcomes assessment, gen ed being part of that. So in 2012, the Office of Assessment was established, and by 2014 we had a draft assessment plan for looking at the gen ed curriculum. And then we talked about it for a few years, and in 2017 there was a motion to adopt updated learning outcomes and make the assessment process official. So we did the first scoring session in 2018. A lot of you were involved in that. It was the Western Cultural Tradition Gen Ed block. And then NECHI came last spring, and they said, good job, but keep going. And so in the following May, we had a second Gen Ed scoring session, and we looked at the social context and institutions block. So we're having another one in January. We hope you'll consider joining us. That one will be cultural diversity and international perspectives, and they're really helpful sessions, but we also tend to have a bit of fun, so please join us. So what we do is we sample and collect student artifacts and then score them using a rubric. And these rubrics are modified AAC&U value rubrics. They were developed by faculty teams here several years ago, and they have 4 levels: capstone, 2 milestone levels, and then benchmark. And then we added some other options for artifacts that didn't meet a benchmark level. So these are the results from our last scoring session. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them, but I just briefly want to show you what you're looking at. So these are the 5 different rubric categories. So each one of the bars are a different rubric category. If you want the full long name of the categories, you can ask me at the end and I'll tell you. But the bottom here is the benchmark level. The blue is the benchmark, and then orange and gray are level 2 and 3 milestones, and then a little bit at the top is level 4 capstone. So one major takeaway from this is that a small majority of the artifacts were sitting at around a level 2, and that's not it's probably reasonable since the majority of classes that we sampled were low to mid-level courses. But some additional findings show us that among the scores there was low to moderate reliability, so again that would have an impact on the results. There's also weak alignment between the artifacts and the rubric. So this could tell us, looking at these first 2 findings, this could tell us a couple of things. One, probably the assignments weren't designed with the rubric in mind, and that's likely because they haven't been widely distributed, so probably a lot of people haven't seen the rubric. And secondly, there seemed to be some confusion around the rubric. If you were in the scoring session this last May, we talked a lot about the rubric, and there just seemed to be some confusion. So again, probably given a lack of awareness about the rubrics, that's not totally surprising. But what's important to note here is that these findings are not indicative of course quality. So we didn't really look at specific courses, but if we did and it scored really low, that's not to say it's a bad course. It's not to say that the students didn't have wonderful learning experiences in that course. What it's raising questions about is, do we have a coherent gen ed curriculum? Because that's what NETG requires. And so, again, if you feel like, oh, maybe my gen ed course wasn't great, that's not what we're measuring here. So finally, people who attend these sessions have consistently told us that the discussion with fellow colleagues is the best part. So this year we took those discussions, took notes, did some theme analysis, and made a report on that feedback. And there was one very emergent finding, and it was that there's a lot of confusion around the gen ed curriculum. And some concerns that people raised were that there's too much choice, like we've already said today. Classes possibly no longer fit. Maybe they were developed years ago, and then they've been taught by numerous instructors, and now they've morphed into something that doesn't really fit the gen ed anymore. There was quite a bit of anecdotal evidence on student confusion, students being confused about how to navigate the gen ed curriculum, or what it really means for their life, or my favorite one, if it's the university trying to get more money, so they make them take gen eds. So just a lack of understanding around it, and then many faculty were concerned that people maybe didn't know even what the learning outcomes for the gen ed areas were. But there were some positive comments. One of them being raised was maybe a flexible curriculum is the best for students. They can choose, and they can, if they take ownership of it, they can make it whatever they want to make it. The question is whether or not they're doing that. So from these assessment findings and the research we've done so far, we're not suggesting this is a bad model. We're not saying we need to totally upend everything, but we're saying we need to have a firm handle on what we want and expect our gen ed curriculum to do, and then be intentional about monitoring that it's achieving those goals. So, and now Deb will talk to us about looking ahead.
So, as Mandy mentioned, and mentioned, and Dee had mentioned, one of the issues at hand also is, are there too many choices? So we're at this point where we're thinking, is 900 the right number? Should we have a more cohesive model? This was actually brought up in a faculty forum a couple of years ago, where we had this conversation, and we looked at all the choices out there and other potential ways we could look at this. Another finding that we've looked at is that, as Mandy mentioned, gen ed courses aren't necessarily all aligned with the learning outcomes. So Sam's going to talk a little bit about what we're kind of thinking in fixing that issue right now, but also how we can look ahead. Another, as we look ahead, the thing to think about is the implementation of our strategic vision and values framework. So right now we're entering this period where we're implementing this new framework that we had all that feedback on last year that's now been published to the web. So that's something to think about as we look ahead. Nationally, we're talking about changing national conversation. So now there are kind of as a movement away from this distribution type model, and Thane will talk a little bit about that as he gives some examples as well. And we also know that we have increased competition for fewer students. So as we see the number of high school students decline, we need to have ways to market, and one way is to market our gen ed, to have a really nice branding around our gen ed. So that's something to think about. As well as the changing workforce needs, which we talked about before. This idea of 21st century skills, that's a little bit different than it was when we developed our gen ed model. So as we think about our new strategic framework for UMaine, and this is one of the goals. So as I'm sure you're aware, we have the strategic and values, which was based around had a three-part vision: fostering learner success, discovering and innovating, and growing and advancing partnerships. Now we've published, there's 3 goals within that. And the first one really speaks, we feel, is really where gen ed sits. That we will support and grow Maine's economy through new discoveries and building a workforce whose members are engaged in their communities and prepared for lifelong success. And so within that goal, there are 2 objectives to keep in mind as we think about what the future of gen ed could be at UMaine. One is that our curricula will prepare undergraduate and graduate students for success by aligning tailored academic pathways with the skills needed to thrive in a range of career contexts. So that's one underneath within that goal through that plan. The other is authentic experience in research, scholarship, and/or creative activity will be part of every undergraduate's experience. So as we think ahead, to kind of think how that fits in to gen ed, so as we think about possible reform. So Thane will be talking about some of the high impact practices and also other innovative models that speak to this need as well.
All right, so one thing that we've talked a little bit about already, but is kind of student perception of gen eds. And we talked a little bit, and we just kind of want to start the conversation. For example, I was on one of the first year success groups, and that was orientation. So when do we want to start this conversation? Do we start it much earlier? Is it just between the advisor and the student? Is it then on the web page and those types of things? And in my position as chair and undergraduate coordinator of psychology, at points I've had up to 150 advisees at a time. So I've got a lot of experience from hearing from students. And you hear a number of things. A number of students say, this seems just like high school again. We're not saying that it is, but we need to start figuring out how do we articulate what those values, what this is really for, what is the purpose of gen ed. And as you've seen a little bit so far, our kind of web presence, at least at this point, is not really doing a good job. It's great. I've heard, a lot of students say, hey, I might get a sophomore or a junior as well, and they'll say, my advisor articulated with me what the gen eds are for and why. But then I also have heard from a number of students, my advisor just told me to get through them. Gen eds are to get through. And so we just want to start opening the conversation about, maybe we need some sessions on with helping faculty kind of articulate and understand what the gen eds are and how you might help in terms of advising. Another thing that Mandy talked about, which we saw at this presentation we went to, which kind of blew me away, and I've heard this from students as well. A student basically put up on Facebook or Twitter, the statement, a major requires about 40 credits. You need 120 to graduate. All the rest of those gen eds are so that the university makes money. That had like 2 million likes. Okay, so something is definitely going wrong. And I'm not saying here, across the nation, this seems to be an issue. So one part of that is looking at what other institutions are doing. Again, going back to kind of our web presence versus web presence at other universities. And as you'll see as this goes, right, a lot of universities are really trying to help very early on, including on the web, articulate, what a gen ed education is for. And of course, here's a quote saying it's not just right high school again. And so starting to have some of those conversations. Here is another example from Northeastern. And again, some of this obviously is, I hate to use the term PR, but it's not just PR, right? We're hoping that as we start to think about how we would talk with students about this, it will help us as faculty to really start articulating what are these critical things that we think are part of gen ed. And that we may say we love what we're doing, or we may say, hey, as we start to articulate this and figure out how we would articulate it, we can see some of the things that we would want to change and how we want to modify things. So we think just this process will be very useful for the campus. And then, what are some of these possible areas of gen ed reform? And one thing, and I had the same kind of feeling that I think someone had mentioned. One, sometimes all these courses can be great because it gives you a lot of possibilities, but it also can cause a sense that there isn't really a cohesive pattern here, or there's no kind of cohesive pathway for which students can navigate through this. And there's multiple things that fit into this. It's that we have perhaps 930 classes that fit gen eds, and it's also that we have a lot of outcomes. And it's unclear, certainly when I started this, I actually had no idea what the various outcomes were and so forth. So one thing we want to think a little bit about, and we've started to do a little bit of work, is what are the number of outcomes? And then how does that compare to other places? Right? Do we need as many outcomes as we have? Clearly, a number of universities have the same number as we have. One that we looked at has even more. But then there are other universities that have significantly fewer. So it's starting to have that conversation. What kind of are the core things that we want in our outcomes? We may end up with 38, or we may end up with a lot fewer. And then no matter what our outcomes are, we have to start thinking about how do we get there? We're certainly already making this transition, but do we want to include some of these others, right? And I heard the comment about first year seminars. We've started those. Those are not officially part of gen ed. Do we want to make them part of gen eds? E-portfolios. That's a way where we have a distribution model, but maybe we don't have a way of bringing it all back at the end. E-portfolios allow students to see the things that they've learned in these various gen ed courses, and then you might have a project where they go back and see how they can integrate all that information. Maybe we want to introduce something like that. So we really want to think about how can we get more of these. Tons of undergraduate research is going on. Tons of outreach is going on campus. Can we integrate that in, and would that help us articulate to students what the benefit of general education is? Okay, then for just a few kind of ways in which other universities are kind of thinking about these things, and I really want to stress, these are not mutually exclusive. There's bits and pieces of these that go together. So pathways is just the idea that we need some clear, coherent way for students to actually fulfill the gen ed. Okay? And there's different models, right? That could be simply each department thinking a little bit about what are the common kind of maybe job occupations that their students are going to most likely participate in after college, and create 3 or 4 common pathways and common gen eds that they would go through. Another thing, other universities, they'll say, okay, here are 15, and we're going to have, it doesn't matter what major you're in, you can pick from these 15, and here's kind of a pathway through the gen eds. Tiered is, and there's again different ways to think of tiered. Some of the idea here is maybe there's some critical things like writing and math that we want you to do first. So it might even still be kind of a distribution model, but we're saying, hey, there's some critical courses that you need to do before you can do other courses. Other places, they'll have kind of more basic knowledge down at the bottom, and then they'll have some courses that they say, okay, now we're going to build on that knowledge and work our way up, where each kind of you maybe have 4 courses and then 3 courses that build on those, and then a final course or 2 that take all of those into account. So that's another type of approach that places have taken. And then vertically integrated, somewhat similar to that tiered idea, but in these cases, and what you're not seeing here is this particular model at Las Vegas is somewhat actually of a distribution model, but then they're saying, hey, we have some specific courses within the major that actually grab some of that information that you're learning from these other gen eds and try to figure out how that information fits into your major in a systematic way. And then grand challenges, again, grand challenges can fit into any of these other models. It's like this idea that probably a number of you have heard of, also kind of these wicked problems, right? So what are these problems? They're going to involve information and approaches from all sorts of different fields. Can we get students that are going to be excited about those really cool challenges, and maybe have them take a course or 2 under the same theme and see how different ways of approaching the problem, how you can get little bits and pieces from this approach and this approach and this approach to really solve the problem. And so that can fit into any of these other types of models. Okay.
Well, I go last because I get to be inspired by all this other parts of the talk that go on before it. So one of the possible high-impact practices we're going to talk about is stewardship. So a problem with general education at universities is that it's owned by everyone. And so whose responsibility is it? The individual faculty's incentive is to let it be someone else's problem. So we were interested in how other universities solve that problem. How do they create groups that are the stewards of gen eds, the advocates for gen eds, the group that's trying to spur innovation in gen ed. And so what we saw at the Institute, and also I've put together a short study of other universities that are like us in size and spending per student and graduation rate. What they do is I just create a little typology of what you see out there. What are other universities doing to have an administrative structure for general education? Sometimes they'll have councils, kind of like our UPCC, but for gen ed. Sometimes they have a center for general education. Sometimes there's a director, co-director, it's faculty director for gen ed. And then they'll have committees sometimes. Sometimes it'll be a faculty senate committee, but a bigger, more active faculty senate committee than what we have, or a committee that works under faculty senate. And sometimes it's run out of provost offices, and sometimes you have nothing, no discernible administrative structure at all. And so we have a faculty senate subcommittee that does work on general education, but the size of it has waxed and waned. We have 15 committees now in faculty senate for 50 people. So you're doing good if you get more than 3 people on it. That's the size it was last year. As we talk about best practices or high impact practices in general education, or talk about things like how do we want to promote general education to our students and messaging and things like that, we also need to have a conversation about, well, what kind of administrative structure for gen ed do we want that will promote stewardship and advocacy and innovation in gen ed? And I try it as an experiment. Look at a gen ed system, and you find one you like at a university you like, think this looks good, and I'll guarantee they have one of these kinds of things. The ones that we looked at, we've been missionary examples, none of them have none, they all have some of this going on. Okay, so what we're going to do now I'll end the talking at you part of the program, and now we're going to move to handing out some note cards and doing some more audience feedback. And the big question that we have for you today, I hope you've been inspired by this and learned a lot about what's going on with general education here, but also what's going on nationally with general education as well. And we have one big question for you in this talk, which is how do we engage the campus community about bringing in more of these best practices in general education? So that's a simple task, right? Nothing complex about that. But how do we engage the campus community then about bringing in more best practices in general education? So because it's a big question, we separated it into 3 parts. And you could ignore the timeline. Just look at the 3 parts of it. The way we conceptualize this right now is, first, we want to do more research on these kinds of high-impact practices that Thing was talking about, the kinds of messaging that Dee was talking about, things like that. Research on best practices and research on perceptions of people around campus, faculty and students and others. So the first question then that we'll ask you is about that. Secondly, let's say we make a report that takes all of that information we've learned about general education and presents that to the faculty community. How do we then get feedback on that and turn that into something more actionable? So the knowledge we've created, how do we then get feedback from the campus community on what we've put together? So look at it as a report or a very draft set of recommendations, the knowledge we've acquired. How are we going to get feedback on that? And then what kind of way do we want to go out making decisions about that? Faculty Senate does vote on that, but do we need some other kind of supplementary decision-making process that would come before Faculty Senate, for example? Straw poll of chairs or something? What would we desire for decision-making process? So we'll start with the first of these, research. And on the card we've given you, we'll have you just take a minute and what's our best practice, or what would be the best way to engage the UMaine community on this task of researching general education best practices that are out there, and also researching student and faculty perceptions of general education. A series of open forums, like Strategic Vision and Values, working groups like the First Year Initiative last year, Faculty Senate Gen Ed Committee reporting out to the community and doing the job, a bigger version of that committee, or something else. So we're looking for your advice on this, and just take a minute to give us your thoughts. Question asks, puts the same examples out there.
You want us to collect those and then?
Oh no, they can hang on to them. We can collect them all at the end.
Does anyone need another one?
Yeah, let's do all three, and then I'll ask a couple of people to share advice, and then we'll collect them all.
That's perfect.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, this just asks about, so the first was a question about the actual research. How do we organize doing more research? We know a lot, but as much as we've learned, it just makes us want to learn more, and we do need concrete information. So thank you for your feedback on that. And now, let's say we've gathered a lot of feedback and have a very draft plan or a report that we can present to people. And how do we structure engagement with campus community to gather feedback, get feedback on what we've produced? And I've used these same three possibilities again.
I think we might need clarification, like, on how this is different than the first one.
Well, the first one would be research. So you could conceptualize it as going out, learning more about best practices. How do people use e-portfolios? If someone has research components to their general education, it's one of those high impact practices, how on earth do they actually do that? How do they find the time to advise all those students? So finding out more about those kinds of practices and learning more about them. So we presented some here, we presented some of our research, but we feel we need to learn more about a lot of these things and carry out some of that research. So if we had a set of groups or whatever we had that conducted that research and we knew more about general education, then if we were taking that to faculty and saying, here's what we've learned, much like we've done today, now what out of that are we going to discard, it can't work for us, what out of that are we going to seriously consider adopting here, and how would it work? That kind of feedback, how would you recommend we go about getting that kind of feedback from the campus community? Other than having Faculty Senate vote on something at the end, what kind of decision-making process would you suggest to us for this? And we saw at the Institute, universities handle this in a lot of different ways. Okay, so we're interested in maybe having, we don't have much time, maybe one or two people could tell us, be a brave volunteer and tell us what they thought is a good, what they've written for us, and then we're going to open up for more general questions and answers.
So, just over and over, I've just been hearing like faculty and faculty senate and stuff like that. So like one of my wrap-ups from like all three of those questions would just be that professional staff that work with students are also involved in the process, especially those of us that are professional academic advisors. So yeah, I just think throughout the process, making sure that we're including a lot more voices besides faculty.
Yeah, and we're need a mechanism for that. But whichever kind of these we do, we want that absolutely.
Yeah, so
advisors especially.
whether it's working groups, you know, that those working groups cross all of those boundaries.
Yeah, so I'll just make a comment. At the conference we were at, that was one thing that just came over and over and over again. You know, it involves, doing something like this, thinking about this involves like 30 different groups. And so, at least on our, you know, how we've been thinking about it, it would involve every single group possible.
Similarly to Justin, insert down that the student voice should be part of the conversation as well.
Absolutely. Okay. So
you might also want to consider parents' voices at some level.
yeah, there's groups outside that aren't on campus that would be valuable to have their input. And I think that people like the advising center also, with the recruitment, their office also knows a lot about parent perceptions of it.
I also think that it might be useful to speak with graduates that have gone through the UMaine system to talk about how maybe their general education requirements that they had taken have affected their jobs in the 21st century, because that is a focus of.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I would just say that for this, I think it's, I guess, the Spring 2020 project, I don't see how it could be anything other than working groups. I mean, I think that forums they have a big disadvantage, which is that I think it renders many people passive because it's the nature of a forum. Someone else is prepared to speak to you. But when you're in a working group, a little bit of preparation goes a long way. There's just so much more engagement. And once you start talking informally, it becomes very formal and meaningful, just like a classroom. I don't see how any other possibility for that first step would be viable.
Yeah, it's divisible into groups too. The research
right. And these, I mean, I have a faculty member, but I certainly agree that these wouldn't just be faculty groups. But I would say that from my perspective, sometimes it seems like actually faculty are not participating enough in this discussion. Which is not to disagree with the point about staff as well, but faculty do very well when they talk to each other in a classroom setting, actually, and most people do.
Let's hand this around too, and we'll ask some more questions. Okay, then we didn't do the send this around. Okay, we're going to send also around, and I'll get your question then. A sign-up sheet too, so we want to make sure we get this going around, which is for people who would like to join whatever it is that we're talking about for the spring, or whatever. So we have a Gen Ed subcommittee right now that is doing this work, which is about 14 people, but we're going to take that forward, and so this is your opportunity too to sign up to that. Susan?
Just add additional thought to what Justin said. I would perhaps start with some open fora, just to provide some space for people perhaps from all these different stakeholder groups, because there might be upwards of 30, as Thane said, if you're thinking about employers and alumni and PATFA members, et cetera, staff, advisors, how do you get all those voices in a place where they can brainstorm, and then from there distill it down into working groups? I'm just afraid you start working on what are we working on, and until we are able to really get our heads around what are the possibilities, I'm afraid voices will be missed and opportunities will be missed.
Has anyone given any thought to including the University of Maine at the Chives in this discussion?
They're on our Gen Ed subcommittee now, or someone from there is now on our Gen Ed subcommittee. They've been in a process of aligning their Gen Eds with ours, and so so we need to learn more about that and work with it. Yeah.
And we have intentions to go over there with this presentation.
Okay.
Yes, yes. Absolutely.
I'd
Y'all
like-
didn't know we're taking you on the road. you
Yeah.
know.
Taking the show on the road. I'd like to collect your cards. We really value your feedback, but can you just put like 1, 2, 3 or ABC, just to differentiate the different questions?
And then it's just open discussion now, questions, comments, all those types of things.
We brought it back to those original 4 questions we had up there as you think about whether anything's changed in your mind or you'd like to discuss.
Great training.
Yes?
I don't know if this is definitely not a question. It's not a comment though. I don't know what this is. But I just, in my head, what I'm curious about is as I'm listening to the presentation, which was fabulous, by the way. I'm just curious about how, if you were to survey the students from each of the colleges, how they would perceive the question of gen ed. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and it was interesting at this forum or this conference we went to. That was kind of brought up. Different colleges do think about it drastically differently, and actually some universities actually, and I think Vermont is actually an example of one, where they actually kind of have different. It is a pathway kind of model, but they're drastically different in some sense for the, maybe there's a few core, maybe 3 or 4 classes that are kind of similar, and then they start actually branching out in these different colleges because the colleges have different perspectives on what they want out of it, right? So that's a whole nother model that, and a complexity that gets added here. So I think it's a great question, and it's something that would be, really, we need more data to figure out how we kind of move forward.
So if and when you get to marketing this whole concept, I bet you there's a lot of stories of students that have taken a gen ed course and said, wow, I want to add this as a minor, or, every college has to have those stories, or I decided to, I know from the theater program, there's been several that have added a theater minor, or women's studies, or decided to pursue music or whatever. I mean, I always find that the student stories, when they tell their story of what their experience was, that engages people more than anything else almost, because that's, for lack of a better term, the product. That's what we're affecting. So, just that would be a great way to market it if and when that comes about.
Like URI's website starts with student testimonials. Center is
I think one thing to garner a bit of attention from a broader group of faculty than just those that come here or staff is to share some links with some of those models around the country that are kind of shiny and different, and it gives faculty an image of what it could be, rather than thinking of just a text document of brainstorming ideas about general education. 2, I can't imagine a more uninspiring title than general education. It sounds missionless, and that sort of thing. I think it just has to be rebranded. Even if it's the same outcomes, it has to be rebranded for what it does.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of places that don't call it general education.
One of the things when I was thinking about the questions that I think that might benefit a committee to consider is that a lot of, as a first generation student, there isn't a lot of information like within my family of how college works even. And I know that when I got into college my first year, I knew that I was supposed to take gen eds, but there was no background knowledge of what this is doing for me. And part of that is like the networking, the creating a website that is user friendly, but I think part of that is just taking into consideration that there are a lot of first generation students. There are a lot of students that English is not their first language that are coming into schools and don't quite grasp that there are these classes. Yes, they're interesting, but why are they offered?
I'm wondering, just since you brought that up, how would you feel about that being starting in orientation, right, before school even starts? Would that have been useful?
When I had been enrolled my first semester, there was no real discussion of what classes to take, and I just took a bunch of classes, and it was like, I don't know why I'm taking them.
There's links between gen ed obviously and retention of students too, for that reason. I think Susan was first thing.
I love the idea of the wicked problems. I mean, what a better way to brand it, right? It's very Maine. You could make it this interdisciplinary thing that's very Maine-centric. You know, we have this land grant mission, so it could be something that's very community-focused, that we're, you know, focused on a problem. It could be, you know, faculty working with community partners across disciplines, and I just think something like that could be really, really cool.
Susan, I encourage you to read the book. There's actually a book called Wicked
Yeah,
Problems by
mhm.
Paul Honstedt, and he's a great writer and an interesting speaker, but it's a really interesting concept that usually can work better in small teaching colleges, but I think you're right, we have the right ingredients at UMaine to think about it.
And I think, just to make a use really brief comment, again, you know, also thinking about, as you looked at those high impact practices, it doesn't have to be the same thing for every single student, right? We may be able to get in some of these wicked problem classes. Maybe in some majors that works better than in some others, right? And so where we can, we get those types of things in. So that may be something to think about a lot.
Yeah, in the back there?
One thing I just wanted to add very quickly was it sounded like one piece of this puzzle that we might not be thinking about is what that conversation looks like, or how the gen ed curriculum is delivered. What does that conversation look like? Because like a few people who have spoken here, they talked a little bit about how their advisor may have just said something like, oh, this is just something you have to get through. Well, as folks who do this full time, our whole life revolves around educating students, freshmen in particular, what the education, the general education curriculum looks like, what classes are offered, and kind of the benefits of taking those. So I think we have to, when we're data mining, we need to assess what that conversation looks like, and if the people who are disseminating the information actually have the understanding of what these curriculums look like. Because it might not be the question that we have too many, it might be how we're delivering that information. Because if you look for an enrollment standpoint, that's one sell to our university, is that you can take all of these different options. So just something to think about when you're collecting data.
I just wanted to also throw out there that these different structures may impact programs differently. So I work with undecided students or students that are trying to get into a major. They can often still graduate in 4 years if they can front load their gen eds. But if they're being stalled into this tiered program, and I'm not trying to shut it down, but just something to consider, that it may leave these big gaps where they are taking longer to graduate because of that.
And additionally, precisely because of some little conversation that happened earlier, there are some majors, some areas of inquiry of which students may be pretty unaware, but might actually turn out to be really interested in. And if students have the opportunity to understand that those areas of study are available to them early, then likewise, it can impact a program positively or negatively. Positively, if they find out early, you have more students actually taking courses in that program and supporting that program and keeping it strong on campus. Negatively, if that information isn't made available early, students aren't aware, they come to their final year and they realize that there was something they could have studied and been interested in the whole time, and they've neglected that part of the university. Eventually, that is bad for that part of the university. It doesn't have as many students as it could and doesn't look as strong as it ought to.
Program-specific needs like that have to be, we have to map that out and know what those are.
Given the concept of looking for, towards the future, I would offer sort of a really healthy level of humility insofar as I was preparing a talk for TAs at the beginning of the semester and realized I graduated from my doctoral program 25 years ago. I've never had a job that existed the day I graduated. And it will be more so for our current undergrads.
And so that's, I think you know this very well, that's part of the push, that's the national trend, right, away from onto some of these models, right, that are much more skill-based and integrative and so forth, rather than knowledge-based. And that's part of the push and part of the reasoning behind that.
So,
one of the things I'm thinking about as I'm hearing people talk is one of the key principles I think of Gen Ed is to cultivate curiosity, right? It's about, Gen Ed is supposed to be about being curious. You want to take this class or take this class because you want to maybe get outside your comfort zone, or you think this is something that you might be interested in. And so how do we cultivate curiosity? What are our practices that we put into place to cultivate that? And I don't know the answer to that, and it may look different for different students, but I think it's an important concept to keep in mind as a guiding principle in designing a Gen Ed.
And going off of that point, I understand that our online students are a much smaller population as compared to on-campus students, but if we're really trying to cultivate this sense of curiosity among our students, but we don't really give them the options needed to cultivate that curiosity, that's just something that I think we should be mindful about as we move forward.
One of my favorite learning experiences was called The Heritage of the Western Civilization of Maine. It was a 7-semester hour course that combined history, English, art, music appreciation. So you studied at the time what was going on in civilization, what was the history. You wrote in English, and I don't know how the faculty pulled it off, but it was very different from high school.
We've done that. Yeah, I was part of interdisciplinary courses that was taught by 8 teachers, and we got a big NEH grant about 20 years ago here at the University of Maine, precisely for that, for Gen Eds. And there were maybe the only one left.
Not promising.
But yeah, so we did interdisciplinary courses with faculty from 8 different, and then 8 became too cumbersome, and then we did 5. We had a lot of
and I'm sure, Mandy, from UPCC, you've already been thinking about this, but from the perspective of UPCC, this is something we've been struggling with for a long time, about the number of Gen Ed courses that we have, and also lately, the past few years, our frequency of new Gen Eds coming to UPCC, and as a group, not really have a sense of kind of the priorities and the guidelines of how we should be assessing and approving those. And so just one thing to consider, if this is going to be a multi-year process as we go through this Gen Ed, we might want to consider that maybe new Gen Eds don't come to UPCC for approval, because it sounds like we probably don't want to be expanding. We maybe want to be looking at and evaluating what our priorities are. So I'm just wanting to make sure these two things are lined up, so at the time that we're doing this work, we don't also have all kinds of new Gen Ed courses coming for approval.
It's really interesting, Patty, because when NECHI gave us our first directive in 1999, it was Faculty Senate, CETA, and UPCC. That were the 3 that were commissioned, but UPCC was in the original, like, you're a part of this, you need to be part of thinking about the curriculum. But yeah, some stronger guidelines there.
Yeah, we raised that in Faculty Senate, and there's some pushback to having us do some of that course vetting role, the Faculty Senate Gen Ed Committee, because it's not, Faculty Senate hasn't traditionally been an administrative group, right? And so that's the question, what kind of administrative structure do we want for Gen Ed, so we can have a more purposeful system?
And did you find some that had a separate school for Gen Ed?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So
I mean, there are pros and cons to that. I think
there are, and I guess the one thing that I think Sam did really emphasize, everything that we learned suggested that for this to work well, you need that stewardship, right? It can't just, I think what's happened maybe on this campus, and again, it's going to take some time to dig in and see what people think, but 20 or 30 years have gone by without much stewardship, and so if you don't have that, it just kind of goes out there, and most of these programs that really seem successful really have some, and it's the other thing is a lot of those successful places have a group that includes lots of different folks from lots of different locations on campus. You know, undergrads, graduate students, student life, admissions, all these different areas to really kind of bring it back together. And that's one of the things that we really came back with. I don't think I going in kind of realized how big of a group you really need for good stewardship, or at least best practices. And again, we'll make decisions about whether we want to follow some of those models or not. But I think that was something that we all came back with.
Thank you, Provost Gilbert.
Thank you.
Such fun.
Thank you.